Okay, so today we're talking about fears and phobias and how to address them. And as I said, I am a clinical hypnotherapist, 30 years working with people for fears and phobias. It's a very popular topic. Fears in general are natural. Standing on the top of a cliff and you're looking down at the ocean and rocks below. Of course, it's built into your brain protectively to be afraid. Then as you're going through life, especially in your child formative years, let's say you get bit by a dog, then you can have a fear of dogs. You can even have a phobia of dogs. A phobia would be where, let's say, a little chihuahua comes up to you and you go into this reaction of panic, upset, the fight or flight symptoms. And oftentimes in many situations, there's that crossing of the line of a fear. I think of fears as something we typically manage. They're not fun if they're irrational or unhealthy or unproductive. It's no fun to have them, but they may not curb our behavior. We just have them. So you can have a fear of flying, but still fly. And then you can have a phobia of flying where you literally are the type of person, I've worked with many people with fear of flying who come to me to get help. And then the phobias are where the least little thing, and they're trying to get out the locked door of the airplane. So it's a spectrum of experiences. And again, it's okay to have a healthy sense of caution about things. And some situations, a fear can be reasonable, but you don't want it to run your life. And in general, when you're dealing with fears, we'll talk about phobias in a minute, but with fears, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to identify, if you've identified that there's a fear in your life that's holding you back, keeping you from accomplishing things you want to accomplish or having things you want to have or doing what you want to do, then your first step would be to acknowledge that fear. And I know that sounds obvious, but many people push their fears to the back of their mind. They try not to think about their fears or a fear they have about something. Let's say you have a fear of public speaking, but you have to speak. Let's say it's for weekly for a group Zoom call for work, but you just don't like getting on that call. For some reason, it just makes you feel uncomfortable. You feel self-conscious when you're talking in front of people, and you realize as you would bring it to conscious awareness, yeah, for some reason, I have this fear of, being put on the spot, talking to people and having that experience. Again, it may not stop you from doing the behavior, but man, wouldn't it be a lot more fun and enjoyable to get on those meetings if you didn't have this fear? So tied into this are our coping mechanisms. So how do some people cope with that? Well, they might take a slug of tequila before they do that talk, or many people find in social situations that they're more introverted or shy or self-conscious or highly sensitive. And so they'll drink alcohol as what the social lubrication, okay? Because deep inside, maybe they have this fear of rejection. They have a fear of judgment, things like that. So the first step is that acknowledging that you have that fear and then being willing to break the cycle of perhaps how you're currently coping with it. I've had people who've had fear of driving over bridges. They may know it in the back of their mind, but they've been managing that situation for years, and their coping mechanism has to be just living a life where they don't ever have to drive over bridges, right? People who have fear are conscious, but just fears about driving on freeways. That's been a common one I've had over the years. So what do? They just take the back roads everywhere. So the first step in overcoming a fear or a phobia is looking at your life, seeing if you have it and what it's costing you to persist with that fear or not address that fear. And I had a guy that came to me several years ago, and he had started dating someone after being divorced for many years. And he realized he had this fear of driving on freeways. And he wanted to start taking trips with his new girlfriend. He wanted to go places and travel. And she liked that too. And so he wanted to have these new experiences with her. So we had to work on the problem with it. And so he first had to get to the awareness that it was a problem for him, that it was creating inhibitions or changes in his behavior or adaptations to his behavior that he wasn't happy with anymore, that weren't in alignment with what he wanted in life. And so then it can be as simple, depending on the fear. And if any of you all on the call tonight have specific fears, definitely just drop something to me in the chat, and I'm happy to unmute you at the end of, my sharing. Or if you have questions, drop those in the chat, because the number of fears, types of fears, how they impact you are so infinite that I couldn't really address them all. But if you have questions, please feel free, or you can privately send me a chat on here. If you just, there's a way to do that in the chat, where instead of sending it to everyone, you can send it to me alone. I don't have to mention your name, but I can address the questions without singling you out. So if that's helpful too, of course, you could DM me or work with me privately as well, but I'm happy to answer as much as I can tonight. Okay, so fears always tie into your narrative and your story, and it could be as simple as changing your story. So you can put two people in the ocean, and I live near the ocean here, and I love going into the water, but there's other people that live here that won't dip a toe in the ocean because they're afraid of sharks. So some people are fine with that. They've coped by changing their behavior, curbing their behavior. They just don't go in the ocean, right? And so there's a cost for that, but maybe it's not, the cost isn't too high, because maybe that person doesn't really particularly like sand or getting the sun, or doesn't like salt water or whatever. So again, but if that fear is costing you something, that you feel the cost is too high, the pain is too great, the pleasure of what you could have if you overcame that fear, then you want to first start looking at the story. Could I change my story? If it's irrational fear, then you want to look at changing, talking yourself out of that fear. But a lot of times, if it is an irrational fear, and again, we'll talk separately about phobias because it's a little bit different. But if it is an irrational fear, it almost always goes back to something in childhood, something before the age of typically 11. But if it was really traumatic, it could be later on in life. So I had a woman who came for fear of driving on freeways. And when we tracked back in hypnosis using a hypnotic technique to where her fear of driving went to, she had been in the car one night when she was a teenager driving a long road trip. She fell asleep at the wheel and woke up just about as the car was going to go into the ditch in the side of the road on the freeway, and she was able to correct herself. Her father woke up and screamed, and she was able to get back on the road, but it really shook her up. And after that, she was afraid to drive. And so for her, the biggest piece, the biggest part was changing her narrative. And how do we do that? I asked her if she was or felt herself to be a good driver. And she said, and I saw it, I saw the brain change in that moment. She's like, yeah, actually, I'm a really good driver. And I said, okay, then. And you were a teen driver then. How long had you been driving? And she's like, well, not very long. And I said, and how often do you drive when you're sleepy or overnight? She said, I never do that now. And it was like, boom, the shift. And it was that simple, and it was done. And she was able to drive after that. And honestly, that when those things happen, like, I can never project or tell if a shift for someone is going to be like that, if it's going to be easy, or if it's going to take some time. It has nothing to do with what the root cause of the experience was. And hers was, pretty scary. But she was able to just change her narrative. I am a good driver. I don't drive at night. I don't take risks. I'm a safe driver. I don't speed. I don't make choices on the road that are dangerous, to what extent I can control that. And so then she was on her merry way and has done great with her driving experience. Then I had a woman for fear of flying. Now, it's interesting with fear of flying because, they do say that technically, and I'm sure everybody has heard this story, that flying is actually statistically safer than driving. And if you think about it, it makes sense because the person flying the plane has had thousands of hours of training, and a lot of the people on the road have had very little training in driving. And so anyway, when we did her hypnosis to go to where her mind made that imprint, this is something that's really important with fears and phobias, that almost always you may even think where the fear and phobia came from, but you may not be entirely correct as to what's contributing to that fear or phobia. So this is a perfect example. I had this lady that came to see me when she was about in her 40s. She said, I've been flying for about 15 years, and all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, I started having really, really bad anxiety when flying. Bad so much that I get panicky, I break into a sweat, my heart starts racing, and I just want to like crawl out of my skin. And that's almost phobic right there when you're describing those types of symptoms. So the first step I teach anybody who has that level of anxiety is I teach you hypnotic techniques for shifting out of automatic fight or flight mode into the relaxation response when you start to sense your own symptoms of anxiety. So what I mean by that is if you're in any situation where you see a pattern of you going into fear, anxiety, or a phobic response, which is basically panic, where you just want to like tear out of there and escape, and your heart's racing and maybe you feel like you're going to pass out, you have those extreme symptoms, that the first thing you want to learn, and this is what I taught her, is that you want to train your body how to have a relaxation response to your own symptoms of anxiety instead of fight or flight. So think about it. Pro athletes, you see they're under a lot of pressure. They have thousands of people watching them when they play their sport, potentially if it's like basketball, football, soccer, maybe not so many people when they're normally playing golf, but maybe hundreds, maybe fewer, depending on where they are. But they have to learn to, when they feel the symptoms, heart racing, body tensing, maybe the mind starts to get distracted, they have to learn how to direct the body to relax at will. So you'll see basketball players, that's my demonstration of that. But yeah, you'll see them, they shake it off. They shake it off and then they make that free throw. Baseball pitchers have to shake it off before they make the throw. So for so many different sports, if they're tense, you can't throw as hard, you can't pitch as hard, you can't swing as hard. In golf, if you're tense and anxious. So pro athletes, most of them have to learn by design, from the nature of what they're doing, they have to learn how to relax the body when they feel that pressure, when they feel that stress, when they feel that anxiety coming on. And guess what? You guys can learn it too. So that's the first step I teach my clients and my students, is how to affect that relaxation response. And most people learn to do it just through a progressive relaxation. So you start with your facial muscles, you're checking for any tension. If you listen to most of my recordings, I'm always including a progressive muscle relaxation because, man, that's like universally one of the most simple, easy things you can learn to do for yourself is relax upon command. And so emergency responders, doctors, nurses, paramedics, people going to fires, police officers, they all have to learn how to relax when they feel stressed, when they feel anxious. So they learn how to do that instead of this. They learn how to calm their mind, and we'll talk about that next step. So I taught this lady how to, through a recording, how to relax her body. So when she started to feel the symptoms coming on during flying, she could do the opposite. And for myself, one time when I was doing I was set to do a speech because I was invited to speak to the Women's Bar Association of Charleston, South Carolina, when I first moved here. And I'm coming from California, the hotbed of alternative health, open-mindedness about alternative ways of healing and addressing problems. But the lady who was running the monthly meeting was looking for speakers. She invited me to go. I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll get chewed up by these women. They'll think this is hocus pocus or whatever, woo-woo, or maybe it'll be really great. So I'm driving downtown from the suburb where I lived, and I'm new to the area. I'm not anticipating correctly the amount of traffic that's at lunch hour, downtown Charleston. So I'm starting to realize, oh my gosh, I may be late. I may be late and I'm the speaker. And I could feel my heart start racing. My armpits were sweating as I'm stuck in traffic. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so embarrassing. And I literally started doing the head to toe relaxation. I checked my shoulders, I let my shoulders drop, and I'm checking all my muscles and I'm making my body relax at will instead of going into a panic mode, a fight or flight. So then after that, the second step that everybody will want to learn for a fear and a phobia, I believe, is you do want to go to root cause. You want to find out where back in time your mind took on this fear or phobia. Again, fear meaning like it's persistent. Okay. Every time I go for a public speaking, pretty much I have a fear. Every time I fly. So again, there's this subtle distinction between fear and phobia. So for this lady, she says, up until 2 or 3 years ago, I've been fine flying. All of a sudden, I'm not fine anymore. And so in her second session, we tracked back in a hypnotic technique, again, one that I teach in my school, where did this come from? And so as we're following the thread of that back in time, 2 or 3 years ago, she was on a flight. The flight was bumpy. There was a lot of turbulence, and then the flight did a little drop. I don't know that I've ever been in a plane when that happened, but I'm sure most people would not enjoy that experience and find it a bit perturbing, right? So that was what I call the moment in time where the brain reactivated something, a feeling that it recognized from earlier in childhood, like I said. So 2 or 3 years ago, this little drop happened, and her brain decided at that point, flying is dangerous. It's not good. So then every time she gets on a plane, her body goes into these fight or flight symptoms, whether there's turbulence or not. And it's the mind's protective mechanism. Our subconscious mind is built for survival, physical survival, mental survival, emotional survival. So this is a survival mechanism. After that, the brain says, flying, not so good. Let's not do that. But she overrides it. That's why I call it a fear, because she's able to override it. And so this is what I know about the subconscious mind, that this is where it gets so, so fascinating. This is just where it gets like mind blowing to me, is that we track the fear back. Is that fear back there any earlier in time? Similar feelings, similar symptoms in any situation. You can't make this stuff up, guys. She's back at age, she said like 3 years old, 4 years old. She is in her family home. Her older stepsister, who's probably about 12 years old, has her by the ankles and is hanging her over the second floor balcony going, woo, woo, I'm going to drop you. I'm going to drop you, you know, and whether her older stepsister is evil or just thought she was being playful, this 2 or 3 year old version of my client was terrified. And so then what happens in that moment when that occurs is that the subconscious mind made an imprint. And what it does is when you have a traumatic event like that, and at that age 2 or 3, that was traumatic for her. It really was. The mind will search and seek all the data and categorize certain elements of it as danger, bad, stay away, not good, right? So here's what happened the 2 or 3 years before she came to see me when that plane did that. Woo, drop. It happens, and the brain is startled, recognizes the feeling, and says, oh man, I knew this feeling. This is bad. This is dangerous. I could die. I recognize this feeling. And it goes back to that when she was 2 or 3 years old. Now, did she know any of this consciously? No, she did not. And that's what's so mind-blowing to me about hypnotherapy. I mean, it just always reinforces that it's such a powerful modality, because then once she was able to, in the hypnosis session, make the connection, and it's logical and it's self-serving, it's a survival mechanism. The brain says, I recognize this feeling. It's not good. We're going to avoid it. But it didn't tell her that consciously. It happened unconsciously. So then in the hypnotic session, bringing that to light, we can update her brain, do a little cognitive reframing. You know, in that situation, when she was 2 or 3, she didn't have power. She wasn't in control of like being in that situation. But as an adult now, she's choosing to fly when she flies. No one's forcing her to do it. And we were able to basically update her brain to release that feeling of danger and powerlessness and unbundle it, the attachment of that labeling of extreme danger, fight or flight, to flying after that. For me, and I'll say, I had a similar situation happen to me that was an irrational fear. Just to give you another example of what this looks like and how you unravel it and how you resolve it, is when I was in my 30s, I was mountain biking. I fell off my bike. I just had this little tiny scar right here where I fell, and I dislocated my shoulder, and I had just teeny little tiny fragments in my elbow right there. And the doctor said, you should probably get those taken out. It's just a little incision. We go in there, we pull them out, and, you know, that's all good. He said, but I'm going on vacation. Can you wait 2 weeks? And he put my arm in a sling. And I said, okay, fine. So I've got 2 weeks before this surgery, and it's scheduled. It's on the books. It's like the most minor surgery you could ever have. And I'm starting to have, every time I think about going to the hospital, I'm having waves of like knee trembling anxiety about that surgery. And what do I do? What do we normally do? Just push it away. It's irrational. I'm just going to push it to the back of my mind. And that probably happened for a few days. It comes up. I'm like, what the heck? That's stupid. This is simple. This is nothing. You push it to the back of your mind, right? So finally it comes up again. I'm like, okay, I got to look at this. I got to see what this is about. So I can do self-hypnosis. I close my eyes. I start doing my relaxation, breathing. I go into when I was having that feeling earlier in the day, you explore the feeling, what you're feeling, what the symptoms are. If you hear yourself saying anything to yourself. And I didn't hear myself saying anything to myself, except I just don't like hospitals. I don't want to go to the hospital. And, but it was more the feeling of panic and feeling trapped. Feeling trapped was what I noticed, like a panic feeling, I'm trapped, and like a heaviness in my body. And so then I follow this feeling back in time and I'm like, bing, oh my God, I remember. So when I was 9 years old and 6 years old, I had to have some surgeries as a little girl. And the one that I went back to, I'm 6 years old, I'm in the hospital somewhere in, I think, Philadelphia, New Jersey. And back then, for whatever reason, parents couldn't stay at night in the children's wing. Lord knows they would never do that now. Your parents could always stay with you when you're 6. But I was alone. And I'm in this room with, actually, there was another kid in there too, in the hospital. There was a curtain between us, so I couldn't even see him. And he's screaming, moaning, crying, and I want to go home, and I want my, whatever. And he's little, so that, that could happen. And me being an HSP, highly sensitive person, I'm just so stressed out because, first of all, it's very difficult for us to want to feel with. And when you're, 6 years old, having to deal with some other kid in that level of fear and anxiety is really, really difficult. So all of a sudden I hear the door fly open to our room, and I hear the nurse come in. She goes in where he's crying, and all of a sudden it just like on a dime, the whining and the crying stops. And for like the 30 seconds or something, when it was just dead silent, here I am, 6 years old. I think she's killed the kid. I don't know. It's like right out of a horror movie or something. Okay. But I'm 6. So, your mind goes where it's going to go at age 6. Then she whips open the curtain. She comes over. She's got this tray, flat, lineup of like 6 needles. And she says, see these? You cry like that, you get one of these. And I'm like, ah, and didn't realize it at the time. If you had asked me, prior to those panicky, anxious feelings, hey, you remember that time you had to go for surgery when you're 6? I'd be like, yeah, what about it? Right. Yeah, it happened. But at the subconscious level, my mind made a conclusion at age 6. Hospitals are dangerous. Do not go there. I don't like hospitals, right? Of course, that would be a conclusion. But to the point of, it was such an intense experience for me at age 6, so scary, so upsetting. You make that imprint and then it'll lay dormant. Here's the other piece that's so fascinating, guys. It will lay dormant in your subconscious, maybe never come forward as something that impacts your life until later on in life you experience something that's related or not related, like the flying and the dropping, where your mind says, yeah, I remember that feeling and it's not good. We're not going there. We're not doing that. Right. So for me, once I had that awareness, it was like a soap bubble, guys. Sometimes your emotions, things can be, it's just like it intensifies and then it just pops. And I'm like, okay, that's where that comes from. So I was able to just let it go for me and just say, no, this is, I'm a sovereign being. I want this surgery. I need this surgery. It's okay. And I didn't have the anxiety anymore after that. So it is important, oftentimes, if you've been struggling with a fear or a phobia for a long time and it seems irrational, don't beat yourself up about it. That is, I always say you come by it honestly. And what I mean by that is that there's a reason for it. at the subconscious level, your subconscious mind is well intended. If you have what seems to be an irrational fear or phobia, I promise you, your subconscious mind thinks it's protecting you or preserving you by giving you that fear or giving you that phobia. So the other thing that I do for most of my clients is that many of them trend to having general anxiety. Not all, but many of them do. And so if you understand you can't go into fight or flight, like I told you, you can put two people in the ocean. One person's happy, one person's going into fight or flight. What's the difference? Their stories, right? So you want to become, with hypnosis, people think it's losing control, giving over control, but it's really learning more control over your thoughts. And so the other thing that I teach people is what I call a thought stopper, anxiety thought stopper. And that's a technique. It's a combo of a hypnosis and hypnotherapy and neurolinguistic programming technique where I give you a hypnosis recording to train your mind to stop what I call going in the ditch, to stop going into those stories that are creating chronic anxiety for you or general anxiety or contributing to the situational anxiety. So most things that people have phobias for, that's obviously situational anxiety, going in elevators, flying, driving, dogs, snakes, public speaking, needles, blood. I've dealt with a lot of different phobias. And so if it's a situational thing, then once we identify and clear where your mind took on that pattern, you also want to get really good at not allowing yourself to consciously and subconsciously go into any stories that are going to put you in fight or flight. And that's easier said than done, because someone might say, oh, well, don't think about the plane crashing, or don't think about your car somehow jumping up over the guardrail and going into the water over the edge of the bridge. You know, a lot of these fears, they are irrational. The stories that are going through your mind are irrational. And you can't oftentimes just tell yourself stop, because anybody who ends up in my office, if they could do that, they wouldn't be coming to get my help, right? So some people can just say, stop that shit, cut it out. There's a Bob Newhart story show a clip from an old episode that my dad used to have us watch that when we were little kids, the Bob Newhart show. And he's a therapist and he charges, he said, $5 for 5 minutes, and he only accepts $5. And most of his therapy is like 3 minutes. And basically, if you want to Google it on YouTube, it's hilarious. I think it's funny, but basically every single person that comes in that has a phobia or a fear, his advice is 2 words: stop it. And I'm like, if it was only that easy. And I laugh because it's not that easy for a lot of people, but there is actually an easy step-by-step process for it if you know what it is. And so if you can train your mind outside of that situation, or the situational anxiety, the things that trigger your anxiety, if you can become the master of your mind, that means you have to become more vigilant and more intentional and more aware of your thoughts in order to stop going into the stories that create anxiety for you. For me, being a highly sensitive person, if any of you watching this now or later and you are a highly sensitive person, I am going to tell you hands down, a life skill you have got to learn is to be more intentional with your thoughts, because highly sensitive people, you can go back and watch, if you scroll back through my podcasts from, I think, last fall, there are 2 back-to-back episodes I do on the highly sensitive person. And one, it's a genetic trait. It's not a weakness. It's a genetic trait. And basically, when they do brain mapping, if you're a highly sensitive person, the genetic trait is called sensory processing sensitivity. Your brain registers everything more intently. Emotions, most of you would call yourself an empath. You're probably an HSP. You register maybe for some HSPs, they register sound more intently, texture more intently. It's not autism or anything like that. It's just that your brain is more highly calibrated to feel more, sense more. So part of that is too, that so many people don't know about, is that if you're a highly sensitive person and you're running a story through your mind of something fearful happening, it can put you into fight or flight faster than someone who's got the warrior gene. So the warrior gene person their brain is wired to be able to go out there and, from tribal times, kill animals and not be so sensitive to bring them home for people to eat. They can go out there and kill to protect the tribe. So their brains, people who have the warrior gene in their genetics, they trend to be less affected by their own stressful stories. If you're the opposite, if you're the HSP, and again, I teach all about that. I'm very passionate about teaching about that, but just in general, to explain to you, if you are an HSP and you run a story through your mind about your car crashing on the bridge or something bad happening, or you watch the news, it's hitting your nervous system in IMAX mode instead of regular movie mode. It's hitting your nervous system in 3D when everyone else experiences it in 2D, and that can highly influence you to be more likely to have fears and phobias, in my opinion, because you're just more sensitive. And it's not just to feeling, energy, and emotions. It's also you're more sensitive to your own thoughts. And that's why I go back to, you have to be very, very vigilant with your thoughts. So for myself, I had a spiritual experience several years ago, and I was aware that my anxiety was really out of control. And the solution to that was not to try to numb out the anxiety or push it away or ignore it or beat myself up for it, for being weak or too sensitive. I had to train my mind to be more positive, to stay at or above the line, at being neutral, positive. So the technique I'll tell you about that I do put into a hypnosis recording, but you can learn to do this on your own without it. It's a combo of an NLP technique and a visualization technique. But when you find yourself going into any kind of fear, phobia, or stressful thought, you do want to say to yourself, stop. That's the first step. Stop. Like I'll say to myself, stop. Don't even go there. And my margins are this big where they used to be, this big. And what I mean by that is I would go into a story, think about it, and then all of a sudden I find myself feeling very, very anxious. Now, if I start to think of a stressful story that I know, because I'm so sensitive to my own thoughts, I can put myself into fight or flight, being that my brain is wired that way. I'm like, nip it in the bud. Like I start to feel or hear myself go into that story. I'm like, boom. I'm like the parent, doesn't even let the words get out of the child's mouth. I'm like, nope, no, we ain't going there with that, because you know where that takes us. Right? It takes you into stress, anxiety, not being in the moment, even incapacitated from functioning, derailed, emotionally siphoned and drained. It's just, there's nothing good about it. So day by day, you train your mind to not go into that. And the NLP technique that I teach my clients is that you imagine one single photograph in your mind that represents that whole stressful story. You pull the photograph out of your mind, you see it. It's like the thumbnail for the Netflix. You see the photograph behind the title, you drain all the color out of it, you turn it to black and white, explode that photograph into a million tiny pieces, and then you turn your mind to what you want to have happen, a positive story, same topic or different topic. But the goal is that you do not allow yourself to go into stories that don't serve you. Now, for fears and phobias, there are a couple other steps that I do that that really, really helps situational anxiety, situational phobias. But at the crux of it, you have to train your body to have the relaxation response at will. You have to stop the anxious stories from running you into the ground, ruling your emotions, ruling your reactions. And you get very, very mentally strong, that muscle strong, to not allow yourself to get derailed and go in the ditch with stories that don't serve you. Now, if you're not aware where it comes from, that's where the hypnotherapy's got to come in typically. Maybe from this conversation today, you'll figure it out, and it could be enough to know, like my one driving client that I mentioned in the beginning, that she can just change the story. Now, I'll tell you some other things where I had two women. I've had lots of people for fear of driving over bridges. Where I live in the Charleston area, we have 3 rivers, lots of bridges. You almost can't avoid them if you live here. So people have to reckon with that fear. And I had a lady who came down from New York, and she wanted to get help with that. And when we did her session of going to root cause, as I call it, where her mind took on this imprint, she never connected the dots. It wasn't a memory that was unconscious to her. She remembered the memory. She just didn't know and connect that that's where her mind took the imprint on. So this is another really important piece to understand about fears and phobias. So she's on the bridge. It does go back to a bridge, but the memory that it goes back to is she's on the bridge, Brooklyn Bridge in New York. She gets a phone call from her boss, and her boss says, "Hey, we're letting you go. You don't have your job anymore." And she's really upset. She said she felt a rush of adrenaline. She felt powerless. She felt upset. She's in shock. She's in this, and what does the subconscious mind do when we're in those types of situations? Because of its built-in survival mechanism mode, when you get that rush of adrenaline, when you have intense emotions that come on that feel very bad to you, the subconscious mind looks around to see what it perceives is the cause of it, so you avoid that situation. So again, if you get bit by a dog when you're little, you get that rush of adrenaline, then the subconscious mind looks around, sees the dog, and says, "Oh, dogs are dangerous. We don't do dogs anymore," right? Sometimes the connection's obvious, sometimes not so obvious. So in that session, we were able to clear the subconscious mind association with bridges and danger and a very bad fight or flight, helpless feeling. Another very similar situation when I worked with a woman to track back her phobia of bridges. She would literally have panic attacks going over bridges. So when we tracked back root cause for her, she's sitting on the bridge, Ravenel Bridge, beautiful bridge they built here in the last decade or so. And again, interesting, she gets a phone call. For her, she's got her 2 kids in the back seat. It's from her soon-to-be ex-husband. He's yelling at her, and he's threatening that if she doesn't do what he wants in the divorce agreement, that he'll go after the kids and she'll never see them again, and blah, blah, blah. So what happens? She's on the phone. She's talking to her husband. She gets this rush of adrenaline, feeling powerless, feeling scared. feeling upset. The subconscious mind, again, looks around. What the heck is causing this? We don't want this. We don't like this. Ah, this big bridge. Okay, bridges are bad. And that's how it happens. Again, not rational. And that's why so many people get stuck, guys, because the root cause where your mind took on that imprint to say this situation is bad is oftentimes not logical. It doesn't make sense. It does make sense to me once you understand how the brain works, but it wouldn't make sense to most people. So they can't ferret out where the imprint was made, which is oftentimes really important to look at. So I had another client who had fear of talking at weekly meetings for work. Now, a lot of people have public speaking fears, but they overcome it. They grit their teeth, they work through it, or they do some self-concept work, which is like building self-confidence in your speaking abilities, feeling confident in your intelligence. So not every fear and phobia, some of it we do address in that way, working on people's self-concept. But for her, when again, we did the root cause session, immediately she had this epiphany that her boss's voice, and her boss was somebody she really, really liked, actually. And he led the Zoom calls once a week. And she didn't see him otherwise because she worked on site when she did her job for contracts, whatever she did. His voice, she said, sounded almost identical to her father's voice. But she had a very different relationship with her father. With her father, she was she felt very criticized. He treated her in such a way where it would feel scary to her. He yelled, whatever. So the subconscious mind added an association. In NLP, we call it an anchor, but there was an association with that voice and feeling powerless and feeling scared, feeling uncomfortable, feeling anxious. So boom, like a soap bubble for her, the minute that she became aware, oh, that's why I feel anxious when I'm on these calls, because my subconscious mind associates that tone of voice that my boss has with, like I said, anxiety, etc. So it's such cool work, guys. I do teach it. You can check out my website at American Hypnosis and Coaching Academy. If you're interested in working with me, or somebody who wants to work through their fear or phobia, or even if you're just curious about it and you're wondering, could this work for you or someone definitely you can message me, and you can go to my website or direct message me, and I'd be happy to help. I hope that you found this topic interesting. I love talking about it. It is fascinating to me. The last thing I would leave you with is that in every one of these situations, this was not a brain these are not people who are weak or should label themselves out as weak. It's your mind trying to solve a problem, a good intention, if you will. Okay, so let me see what Paul says here. Thanks for this refresher, reinforcement on techniques we've discussed. Is it possible to completely shut off these stories in our mind, like removing or repressing them completely? Well, in my experience, Paul, and that's a really great question, does it come down to just shutting them down through the training and NLP techniques? No. I think what is really important would be a form of what's called reframing. So oftentimes, if just having the awareness of where they come from and what beliefs were taken on, limiting beliefs, counterproductive beliefs, destructive beliefs that were taken on, if that's not enough to release the fear or the phobia, then, and part of my work is to kind of be intuitive about, Paul, whether or not that's needed, but oftentimes the other facet of it is to do a cognitive reframe. So for example, my story back in the hospital, it would be to go back and have the client rewrite that story and make it different so that you never had to take on that fear or phobia. So for me, it might be that, the nurse pulls back the curtain and says, "It's okay, honey. It's all fine. I'm here for you, da, da, da." For the girl who had the fear of flying and, her sister was dropping her over, it could have been that she, and I leave it up to the client to reframe it, to make the story different. Sometimes we'll bring in resources, which could be a parent or, whatever. Why that's important, Paul, is that your mind keys off of, operates from the last way you remember something. And that's not just from NLP, that's actually from scientific research. There's a doctor, I have the article on one of my on my trainings module for fears and phobias, but it was from some article that I read years ago, and there was a doctor who was trying to help people with PTSD who were replaying stories from the past, active military, come back, and they're having fears, mostly fears or chronic anxiety from something traumatic that happened to them. And he was actually sedating them with certain types of drugs. I don't remember which ones. And then once they were in that drugged state, they weren't unconscious. I think they were just basically in a drug-induced hypnotic state. He would have them replay the story, give it a different ending, have a different takeaway, which means, you don't come away feeling perhaps powerless again. You tweak the story, because what it said in his research is that your mind keys off of the last way you have thought about a memory, not what actually happened. Isn't that fascinating? So when I read this article, I'm like, oh my God, that's what we've been doing as hypnotherapists for years. We just don't use drugs to do it. We induce the hypnotic state naturally, and then we take them back to the root cause, and you see what happened, what the imprint was that was made, which is the beliefs and thoughts that were taken on at that time. And you do that reframing, making that story different, so you didn't come away with that fear of bridges, or you didn't come away feeling powerless. That's a big theme for fears and phobias, is a feeling of powerless. So it doesn't matter oftentimes what the story is. I let the client in the hypnotic state intuit what that story is, the reframe. And that's what's really fascinating. It's far better than what I could, sometimes I'll help people, but it is better if it comes from you. And so that's the other thing is, you can't, I don't know that you can completely shut off the stories, but if you do this cognitive reframe and what I call the takeaway, which is what the beliefs were, what the new beliefs are that I want to have instead, then what my sense is, then you can put it on the shelf. It doesn't have to keep broadcasting in the back of your mind, influencing your behaviors, influencing your thoughts, that you've massaged it, looked at it, gotten a different takeaway, taken on different beliefs, and then you've discharged the emotional charge with that memory. That's huge too, because that adrenaline, that emotional charge is what locks in the fear, locks in the belief that you're unsafe in that situation. So that's another piece to it. Again, it's this whole process I teach, and that's an NLP called dynamic spin release. Again, this whole process, it does work. I'm trying to explain it to just the average person. I hope it helps. But yeah, no, you can't just shut off those stories, but you can tweak them so they don't have the same meaning to you, and then you're released from them. So yeah. Okay. So that is it for today. And I hope you guys have a great week and enjoy the summertime weather. Take care. Bye.